A settler pushes west and sings a song, and the song echoes out forever and fills the unknowing air. It is the American sound. It is hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That's our heritage. That's our song.
Ronald Reagan put words to the tender music of the American sound. He gave voice to the dreams of a free people, and his voice traveled out across the oceans, delivering hope to those who yearned for liberty, inspiration to those who fought for freedom. For millions of Americans, Ronald Reagan will always represent the best of our national character, an optimism that radiated into every corner of the world, a strength of conviction that conquered an empire, a faith that restored a nation, and lest we forget, the humility and humor of a favorite uncle. As the old soldiers used to say, with glasses raised, here's...
I came back from the war to the industry and back to my post as a member of the board of directors of the Screen Actors Guild. And at first, we had just finished being allies with the Soviet Union. And my own brother tried to tell me that things had happened while we were all gone in the service and that there were changes in the motion picture industry. And I wouldn't believe him, and I thought, oh, this is Republican propaganda.
In the fall of 1946, a studio workers' strike crippled the motion picture industry.
I discovered by actual participation in the meetings trying to resolve the issues of that strike on behalf of actors, discovered that strike was communist run and run by unions and guilds in the picture business, of which there are some 43, that had been infiltrated and taken over. But there again, I actually discovered that I myself was a participant or on the board of directors of a couple of organizations that were communist fronts. Now, in those days, that was the communist game plan, to take a legitimate organization that seemed to have a legitimate purpose, infiltrate, get control of the leadership, and then with the respectability of many of the members unquestioned, and the organization having a good-sounding name, start taking it down paths it shouldn't be going down.
As Reagan began to speak out against communism and its rejection of basic freedoms, his reception in Hollywood turned a bit cooler.
And I could tell you one experience of mine. As I began to learn first, by way of this strike, what had happened in our industry, I remember then leaving a meeting of the Guild Board and going to a meeting of this other board of directors where I was a member. And by now, I had gone public on the motion picture problem. And I walked into that board of directors meeting of this other organization. Down the center aisle, slipped into a folding chair over on the one side. And every member of the board on that side of the room got over and crossed the aisle and sat on the other side, leaving me all alone on this side. And I discovered something I should have known before and severed my relationship.
While the future president became more concerned with the threat posed by Soviet communism, he also took a growing interest in domestic politics, and specifically in the impact of government regulations.
I've always explained my after-dinner speaking and after-lunch speaking for all those years in Hollywood that if you don't sing or dance, you wind up as an after-dinner speaker. And so I did that, and I did my own speeches, and I tried to... At first, I started out, I felt that I had to speak something on what I was doing anew, and so the subject of my speeches usually would be the real Hollywood versus the fictional version of it and the Tinseltown image that had been given to it. And then to justify my addressing, say, a Chamber of Commerce and explaining how I could justify that kind of a speech to them, I would point out then the discriminations, and many of them government, tax-wise and everything else, against our industry because of that image. There wasn't going to be any politician stand up and defend the bloated people of the tinsel world of Hollywood. And to further bring it home, I would say, and you know, if it can happen to one segment of the society, it can happen to you and your business or whatever. And the funny thing is, as I went on speaking that way, after the speech, increasingly, people would buttonhole me on the way out, businessmen and so forth, and say, let me tell you what's happening to my business. Let me tell you the discrimination, regulation-wise and so forth of government. And pretty soon, Hollywood began to be more or less shrink down to just an introduction, and I was actually writing speeches and delivering speeches on what was happening to the whole free economy in the United States.
A lifelong Democrat whose first presidential vote had been cast for Franklin Roosevelt, Reagan grew in time to see the wisdom of limited government. He became equally convinced that the Democratic Party did not express that wisdom.
One day, I went home from a speaking tour and said to Nancy, it's just dawned on me that I'm out here speaking all the time on this subject, and then come election time, I go in and campaign for and vote for the people that are making these things happen. And I said, it's time for me to change.
Reagan's emergence as an outspoken anti-communist and an articulate critic of big government did not translate into greater prominence in the motion picture business.
It's a very funny thing. In all those years that I was engaged in politics for the one party, the more liberal party, no one ever sent me letters and said, we're not going to go see your pictures anymore because of what you're saying politically and so forth. But it was funny. The minute I switched and became publicly on the other side, you'd be surprised how much mail that kind that I got. I have a feeling, and not just for myself, there were many others. I believe that there was a career penalty in it, that there were certain individuals in the production and direction end and so forth that couldn't quite see you as right for the part. And so you didn't get a part that you might otherwise have gotten.
By the early 1960s, Reagan was a frequent speaker at Republican events, although not yet a Republican.
The last president that I actively campaigned for and with was Harry Truman. And then, as I say, it was getting up around 1960, when I said what I did to Nancy. Now, I didn't get around actually re-registering until 1962. And by that time, however, I had begun to be a speaker at Republican fundraisers. And because in the 1960 campaign, while I was still a Democrat, I went the other way. Well, my first vote, Republican vote, was for Eisenhower as president. That was 52. But so by that time, as I say, I was a speaker at many Republican fundraisers and so forth. And in 1962, with the gubernatorial election coming on in California, I was speaking at a fundraiser, and right in the middle of my speech, a woman stood up in the middle of the audience, and she said, "Have you re-registered yet?" And I said, "Well, no, but I intend to." She said, "I'm a registrar." And she walked right down the center aisle, put the papers on the podium. I signed up and then said to the audience, "Now, where was I?"
Ronald Reagan became a force in national politics in the fall of 1964 with a nationally televised address on behalf of GOP presidential candidate Barry Goldwater.
I had, because our second home was in Arizona, Nancy's father and mother having a home there, and we'd go over every year and bring the children over and all. And in that way, I met Barry Goldwater, and I knew him. And I was greatly impressed by him, and I read his book, The Conscience of a Conservative. And long before anything was being talked about, I said, this is a man who ought to be president. And so I traveled all over the state speaking. And the speech that I eventually made was the one that I had been making and throughout the country. And one night I made it at a banquet, not too long before the election time. And when the banquet was over, one table there of really leading figures in the Republican Party asked if I would sit down with them for a few minutes. They wanted to talk to me, and they asked me if I would do that picture if they made it possible on television. And I said, well, yes.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
And I said that I thought it'd be more effective if they had an audience. So in the studio, they delivered enough volunteers for an audience, and then it was taped, and I made the speech.
We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. Thank you very much.
But then I have to tell you, then the doubts set in. After I had recommended that it be played myself, then I said, who am I to start telling him what, something of the kind? And I just lived with horror of what I might have done. Well, the speech went on. And at about 11 o'clock in California, which was 2 o'clock in the morning back here, a campaign official of his called me and said they thought I would like to know that the phones, the switchboard was still lighting up, and the pledges were coming in. The speech raised $8 million.
As the 1966 election for governor of California approached, state Republican officials began to call Reagan with increasing frequency.
A little group consisting of some of those same people that had been at the table that night at the banquet came to see me to talk to me about running for governor against the incumbent Democratic governor who was seeking re-election. And they put it on the basis that I could unify the party. And I said, no, let me do the things I'm doing. I'll go campaign for whoever you decide is the right candidate. And they were very persistent. And they kept after us so long that finally I said, look, I'll tell you, if you will, for the next 6 months, if you make it possible for me to accept all the speaking invitations around the state, I said, I will let you know December 31st whether I should be the candidate or not, whether you're right or wrong about whether I could win. And I honestly believed that no, someone else should be the candidate. But I went out and they did fix it up. They hired one of those PR political firms, and I started speaking and accepting these, and mainly political speeches, but not entirely. Because I thought it wouldn't be fair just to go to a party, a meeting of some kind. So it was chambers of commerce and opening of United Fund drives and all that sort of thing. And I was coming home as it got toward December and saying to Nancy that maybe they're right about this winning business. And then we finally got down to, well, we couldn't sleep well, and saying to each other, could we ever live with ourselves if they're right? And we said no. And talking always about unifying the party, that healing this split, this wound. And finally, I said yes, and I have to tell you something. I look back on it now, and I can't understand. I actually said yes only on the basis that I thought I could win the election. And I went into the campaign before I realized that, yeah, but if I win, I've got a job for several years. I'm in a different line of work. I'd thought only as far as November when I said yes. And we did put the party together.
Elected to the first of 2 terms as governor of California in 1966, Reagan cut taxes and led the state through perhaps the most tumultuous period in its history.
And it's true, I guess I was burned in effigy on more campuses in California than any other person ever has been. If I went near a campus, I could start a riot when I was governor.
After an unsuccessful challenge to President Ford for the Republican nomination in 1976, Reagan emerged as a strong presidential contender in 1980.
As 1980 began to get closer, the same thing was happening. I was being approached by people and groups and from all over the country who suggested that I should be a candidate.
On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Wilson Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States of America.
Faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Now, I congratulate you, sir.
So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look.
In his first year in office, President Reagan signed into law the largest tax cut in American history and launched the Reagan Revolution, a movement to liberate the American people from excessive government regulation.
I've often told a little example of the difference between government and certainly at the national level and someplace at the community effort. And this was the little town that decided to raise their street traffic signs from 5 feet to 7 feet. Thought it would be safer and more visible for the motorists. Federal government said, but we have a program to do that. We lower the pavement 2 feet.
By rebuilding U.S. defenses and supporting freedom fighters around the world, President Reagan raised the costs of maintaining the Soviet empire. By the end of the decade, the Soviets could no longer afford to pay, and Reagan had won the Cold War without firing a shot.
We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have.
Meanwhile, his tax cuts had helped to spark an unprecedented economic boom. Reagan's principles of free enterprise, limited government, and a strong national defense inspired an entire generation of political leaders.
My fellow citizens, our nation is poised for greatness. We must do what we know is right and do it with all our might. Let history say of us, these were golden years when the American Revolution was reborn, when freedom gained new life and America reached for her best.
And in the midst of his second term, Reagan spoke about the conservative movement he had led to national prominence.
I think it's pretty solid. And I think that it has overcome what his greatest threat was in the beginning, and that was the effort on those who were opposed to paint the conservative movement into a corner as some kind of a radical, well, they even used the word fascist many times, organization. And I think it's overcome that very well. I think also that we in the conservative movement have learned some things. I remember early on when I first became governor, and I did something in which I got part of what we were after and settled for that. And a couple of die-hard conservative legislators in California just called me a traitor, that I had betrayed the cause. Well, actually, what they wanted was, if you can't get everything, jump off the cliff with the flag flying in defeat. And I have always figured, look, if I can get 60, 70, 75% of what we're trying for, that doesn't mean you settle for that. You take it. And then from that point, you start trying to get the rest that you didn't get. And I think that that's happened to the movement also. We recognize that you're never going to be able to come in with a platform of every single thing that you want and get it 100%. There are still other people with other views that have to be convinced.
Reagan's unquenchable optimism was on full display when he reflected on America's future.
I don't know how to explain it, but all I know is that in these last campaigns, it's been the greatest thrill to, I have campaigned on some campuses, and to see those young people out there, and to see, above all, their patriotism. To hear them chanting USA, USA. And I just from all that I've seen, this is quite a generation of young people. It even extends over into the young people in our military. The percentage that are in the highest intelligence bracket in the military today is the highest percentage ever in our history. We have the highest number of high school graduates ever in our history. But I go to bed every night thanking the Lord that it looks like the country's going to be in good hands in the 21st century.
We hope you've enjoyed the essential Reagan story told by the man who lived it. But if there's one thing better than seeing the Gipper in an interview, it has to be watching him deliver a great speech. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Ronald Reagan's most powerful moments on the world stage.
We're approaching the end of a bloody century plagued by a terrible political invention, totalitarianism. Optimism comes less easily today. Not because democracy is less vigorous, but because democracy's enemies have refined their instruments of repression. Yet optimism is in order, because day by day, democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower. From Stettin on the Baltic to Varna on the Black Sea, the regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish their legitimacy. But none, not one regime, has yet been able to risk free elections. Regimes planted by bayonets do not take root. The strength of the solidarity movement in Poland demonstrates the truth told in an underground joke in the Soviet Union. It is that the Soviet Union would remain a one-party nation even if an opposition party were permitted, because everyone would join the opposition party. America's time as a player on the stage of world history has been brief. I think understanding this fact has always made you patient with your younger cousins. Well, not always patient. I do recall that on one occasion, Sir Winston Churchill said in exasperation about one of our most distinguished diplomats, "He is the only case I know of a bull who carries his china shop with him." But witty as Sir Winston was, he also had that special attribute of great statesmen, the gift of vision, the willingness to see the future based on the experience of the past. It is this sense of history, this understanding of the past, that I want to talk with you about today. For it is in remembering what we share of the past that our two nations can make common cause for the future. I believe the renewed strength of the democratic movement, complemented by a global campaign for freedom, will strengthen the prospects for arms control and a world at peace. I have discussed on other occasions, including my address on May 9th, the elements of Western policies toward the Soviet Union to safeguard our interests and protect the peace. What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. Our military strength is a prerequisite to peace. But let it be clear, we maintain this strength in the hope it will never be used. For the ultimate determinant in the struggle that's now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve, the values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated. The British people know that given strong leadership, time, a little bit of hope, the forces of good ultimately rally and triumph over evil. Here among you is the cradle of self-government, the mother of parliaments. Here is the enduring greatness of the British contribution to mankind, the great civilized ideas, individual liberty,
representative government, and the rule of law under God. I've often wondered about the shyness of some of us in the West about standing for these ideals that have done so much to ease the plight of man and the hardships of our imperfect world. This reluctance to use those vast resources at our command reminds me of the elderly lady whose home was bombed in the Blitz. As the rescuers moved about, they found a bottle of brandy she'd stored behind the staircase, which was all that was left standing. And since she was barely conscious, one of the workers pulled the cork to give her a taste of it. She came around immediately and said, "Here, there, now put it back. That's for emergencies." Well, the emergency is upon us. Let us be shy no longer. Let us go to our strength. Let us offer hope. Let us tell the world that a new age is not only possible, but probable. During the dark days of the Second World War, when this island was incandescent with courage, Winston Churchill exclaimed about Britain's adversaries, "What kind of a people do they think we are?" Well, Britain's adversaries found out what extraordinary people the British are. But all the democracies paid a terrible price for allowing the dictators to underestimate us. We dare not make that mistake again. So let us ask ourselves, what kind of people do we think we are? And let us answer, free people, worthy of freedom, and determined not only to remain so, but to help others gain their freedom as well.
We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. The air is soft, but 40 years ago at this moment, the air was dense with smoke and the cries of men, and the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of cannon. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion, to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Allies had been told that some of the mightiest of these guns were here, and they would be trained on the beaches to stop the Allied advance. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades, and the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. 225 came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. Behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the Ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs. And before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Puente Hope. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war. 40 summers have passed since the battle that you fought here. You were young the day you took these cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet you risked everything here. Why? Why did you do it? Well, what impelled you to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all the men of the armies that met here? We look at you and somehow we know the answer. It was faith and belief. It was loyalty and love. The men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next.
It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer. And so you and those others did not doubt your cause. And you were right not to doubt. You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. All of you loved liberty. All of you were willing to fight tyranny. And you knew the people of your countries were behind you. The Americans who fought here that morning knew word of the invasion was spreading through the darkness back home. They fought or felt in their hearts, though they couldn't know in fact, that in Georgia they were filling the churches at 4 a.m. In Kansas, they were kneeling on their porches and praying. And in Philadelphia, they were ringing the Liberty Bell. Something else helped the men of D-Day. Their rock-hard belief that Providence would have a great hand in the events that would unfold here, that God was an ally in this great cause. And so the night before the invasion, when Colonel Wolverton asked his parachute troops to kneel with him in prayer, he told them, "Do not bow your heads, but look up so you can see God and ask his blessing in what we're about to do." We stand today at a place of battle, one that 40 years ago saw and felt the worst of war. Men bled and died here for a few feet or inches of sand as bullets and shell fire cut through their ranks. About them, General Omar Bradley later said, "Every man who set foot on Omaha Beach that day was a hero." No speech can adequately portray their suffering, their sacrifice, their heroism. President Lincoln once reminded us that through their deeds, the dead of battle have spoken more eloquently for themselves than any of the living ever could, that we can only honor them by rededicating ourselves to the cause for which they gave a last full measure of devotion. Today, we do rededicate ourselves to that cause. And at this place of honor, we're humbled with the realization of how much so many gave to the cause of freedom and to their fellow man. Some who survived the battle of June 6, 1944 are here today. Others who hope to return never did. "Someday, Liz, I'll go back," said Private First Class Peter Robert Zanetta of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion and 1st Assault Wave to hit Omaha Beach. "I'll go back and I'll see it all again. I'll see the beach, the barricades, and the graves." Those words of Private Zanetta come to us from his daughter, Lisa Zanetta Hen, in a heartrending story about the event her father spoke of so often. In his words, the Normandy invasion would change his life forever, she said. She tells some of his stories of World War II, but says of her father, the story to end all stories was D-Day. "He made me feel the fear of being on that boat waiting to land. I could smell the ocean and feel the seasickness. I can see the looks on his fellow soldiers' faces, the fear, the anguish, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And when they landed, I can feel the strength and courage of the men who took those first steps through the tide to what must have surely looked like instant death." Private Zanetta's daughter wrote to me, "I don't know how or why I can feel this emptiness, this fear, or this determination, but I do. Maybe it's the bond I had with my father. All I know is that it brings tears to my eyes to think about my father as a 20-year-old boy having to face that beach." The anniversary of D-Day was always special for her family, and like all the families of those who went to war, she describes how she came to realize her own father's survival was a miracle. So many men died, I know that my father watched many of his friends be killed. I know that he must have died inside a little each time. But his explanation to me was, you did what you had to do, and you kept on going. Today, in their memory, and for all who fought here, we celebrate the triumph of democracy. We reaffirm the unity of democratic peoples who fought a war and then joined with the vanquished in a firm resolve to keep the peace. From a terrible war, we learned that unity made us invincible. Now, in peace, that same unity makes us secure. We sought to bring all freedom-loving nations together in a community dedicated to the defense and preservation of our sacred values. Our alliance, forged in the crucible of war, tempered and shaped by the realities of the post-war world, has succeeded. In Europe, the threat has been contained. The peace has been kept. Today, the living here assembled, officials, veterans, citizens, are a tribute to what was achieved here 40 years ago. This land is secure. We are free. These things are worth fighting and dying for. Lisa Zanata Hen began her story by quoting her father, who promised that he would return to Normandy. She ended with a promise to her father, who died 8 years ago of cancer. I'm going there, Dad, and I'll see the beaches and the barricades and the monuments. I'll see the graves, and I'll put flowers there just like you wanted to do. I'll feel all the things you made me feel through your stories and your eyes. I'll never forget what you went through, Dad, nor will I let anyone else forget. And Dad, I'll always be proud. Through the words of his loving daughter, who is here with us today, a D-Day veteran has shown us the meaning of this day far better than any president can. It is enough for us to say about Private Zanata and all the men of honor and courage who fought beside him 4 decades ago, we will always remember. We came together in a national crusade to make America great again and to make a new beginning. Well, now it's all coming together. With our beloved nation at peace, we're in the midst of a springtime of hope for America. Greatness lies ahead of us. Holding the Olympic Games here in the United States began defining the promise of this season. All through the spring and summer, we marveled at the journey of the Olympic torch as it made its passage east to west over 9,000 miles by some 4,000 runners. That flame crossed a portrait of our nation. From our Gotham City, New York, to the cradle of liberty, to the cradle of liberty, Boston. Across the Appalachian springtime to the city of the big shoulders, Chicago. Moving south toward Atlanta, over to St. Louis, past its gateway arch, across wheat fields into the stark beauty of the Southwest, and then up into the still snow-capped Rockies. After circling the greening Northwest, it came It came down to California, across the Golden Gate and finally into Los Angeles. And all along the way, that torch became a celebration of America. And we all became participants in the celebration. Each news story was typical of this land of ours. There was Ansel Stubbs, a youngster of 99, who passed the torch in Kansas to a 4-year-old Katie Johnson. In Pineville, Kentucky, it came at 1 a.m. So hundreds of people lined the streets with candles. At Tupelo, Mississippi, at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, a robed church choir sang "God Bless America" as the torch went by. The torch went through the Cumberland Gap, past the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, down the Santa Fe Trail and alongside Billy the Kid's grave. In Richardson, Texas, it was carried by a 14-year-old boy in a special wheelchair. In West Virginia, the runner came across a line of deaf children and let each one pass the torch for a few feet. And at the end, those youngsters' hands talked excitedly their sign language. Crowds spontaneously began singing "America the Beautiful" at the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And then, in San Francisco, a Vietnamese immigrant, his little son held on his shoulders, dodged photographers and policemen to cheer a 19-year-old black man pushing an 88-year-old white woman in a wheelchair as she carried the torch. My friends, that's America. We cheered in Los Angeles as the flame was carried in and the giant Olympic torch burst into a billowing fire in front of the teams, the youth of 140 nations assembled on the floor of the Coliseum. And in that moment, maybe you were struck as I was with the uniqueness of what was taking place before 100,000 people in the stadium, most of them citizens of our country, and over 1 billion worldwide watching on television. There were athletes representing 140 countries here to compete in the one country in all the world whose people carry the bloodlines of all those 140 countries and more. Only in the United States is there such a rich mixture of races, creeds, and nationalities. Only in our melting pot. And that brings to mind another torch, the one that greeted so many of our parents and grandparents. Just this past 4th of July, the torch atop the Statue of Liberty was hoisted down for replacement. We can be forgiven for thinking that maybe it was just worn out from lighting the way to freedom for 17 million new Americans. So now we'll put up a new one. The poet called Miss Liberty's torch the lamp beside the golden door. Well, that was the entrance to America, and it still is. And now you really know why we're here tonight. The glistening hope of that lamp is still ours. Every promise, every opportunity is still golden in this land. And through that golden door, our children can walk into tomorrow with the knowledge that no one can be denied the promise that is America. Her heart is full, her door is still golden, her future bright. She has arms big enough to comfort and strong enough to support. For the strength in her arms is the strength of her people. She will carry on in the 80s unafraid, unashamed, and unsurpassed. In this springtime of hope, some lights seem eternal. America's is. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless America.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. Crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
From devastation, From utter ruin, you Berliners have in freedom rebuilt a city that once again ranks as one of the greatest on earth. And the Soviets may have had other plans, but my friends, there were a few things the Soviets didn't count on. Berliner Herz, Berliner Humor, ja und Berliner Schnauzer. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. Now the Soviets themselves may, in a limited way, be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.